the way that I have this information set up, it's going to let me talk a little bit in detail about some specific vaccine-related sort of cases or some specific vaccine-related scenarios that I hope you will find of interest, and that I hope that you will see kind of how they help you apply a lot of stuff we've been talking about. So I left off last time with a conversation about vaccine complications, and the fact that if I'm going to be all super pro-vaccine, as I am, it's important to admit that there are, in fact, some complications with some vaccines. You can see that the risk of many of these complications is considerably lower than the risk after natural disease, which also includes death in the case of measles or in other things. There is a particularly famous case of vaccine complications that I want to mention. Sometimes people will, when they think about vaccine complications, they will know or they will learn that we actually have a specific system in the United States to compensate people who have vaccine-associated injury. There's actually like a special vaccines court and all sorts of things like that. And so people are like, well, if we have a whole special court for it, then like it must be bad for you. But it turns out that that was actually all done because of a very specific case. That case has to do with a type of vaccine called the Inactivated Polio Vaccine, or IPV, which I mentioned to you guys earlier. So as we mentioned before, polio was a huge problem leading to a lot of paralysis of kids, including also leading to the paralysis of FDR. There were a few different vaccines that were described. This was actually the first one, and it was sort of this major breakthrough in medical science. You can see that it was on the cover of all the newspapers, and everyone was so excited. This was an inactivated vaccine. So in this case, the poliovirus was treated with formaldehyde so that it could no longer replicate, but so that its antigens were still present. The trials were done in 1954. In 1955, the results were announced that there was greater than 50% protection from polio, and they licensed the vaccine the same day, which is like never happens. That's shocking. But that is largely because they were so excited about getting a way to protect kids from this really scary and terrible disease. I always think it's very rude of this nurse to be showing it to the man in the iron lung who is paralyzed and can't breathe. Like, I'm sure he's really happy, but he's still in the iron lung. And what you will notice is that when the inactivated polio vaccine was introduced, there was a dramatic drop in the number of polio cases. Unfortunately, there was also a big problem that happened. This is known as the Cutter incident, which happened because the lab that made this first set of polio vaccine was called Cutter Labs. So that's the name of the pharmaceutical company that was making it. As soon as things were licensed, a whole bunch of the vaccine was sent out to the public. And within 10 days, people started getting polio from having gotten the vaccine. In the end, there were 120,000 doses in this lot. There were 260 cases in either kids or contacts, so people who those kids transmitted to, which led to 113 people being paralyzed. So some people got polio but didn't get fully paralyzed, and 5 deaths. This was all the result of incomplete inactivation. For those of you, actually you've all done lab work because we have a lab section in this class. But in fact, what happened here was that when they made their inactivated virus, they then needed to filter it away from any leftover virus that was still active, and they used the wrong filter. They picked up a filter with the wrong pore size. And so it did not correctly filter out the active virus. There was active virus still left in the preparation. And so as a result, this was sort of why sort of the vaccine injury court was developed. You can imagine sort of the additional safety measures that have come into place as a result of this, and the ways that inactivated vaccines are checked on inactivation, which is part of the reason why sometimes when people tell me they got the flu from the flu shot, I'm like, really? The inactivation slipped through the cracks? Just for you every year? That's impressive statistics. So all of it is really coming from this incident. I am told, obviously I do not recall the 1950s, but I am told that actually there was a generation sort of paralyzed pediatricians, because this was the first lot of polio, and most of the pediatricians, when it came to their office, gave it to themselves first because they didn't want to spread polio to their patients. And so there was the sort of like pediatricians of a certain age were often paralyzed because of this. Though again, having not been around for that, I cannot tell you the full veracity of that story. So when people think about vaccine complications, and when the idea of vaccine complications come up, what do people usually think about? Yeah? Autism. So I just want to briefly mention, so this is the paper that originally indicated the link between autism and the MMR vaccine. You can see that one of the most important things about it is that it has in big red letters over it, retracted, because it has been retracted from the medical literature and removed from the literature. In fact, all of the authors except for the first author, Andrew Wakefield, have admitted to fraud or have admitted that this is false. And Wakefield has been accused of fraud, though he still stands by the study. There's lots that can be said about this. For example, he picked patients to include in his study. He actually picked the kids who went to his son's birthday party as his patients. He was involved in, so there are a lot of things going on with his sort of history, but he was working on making a measles vaccine that was separate from mumps and rubella. So right now, if you get a measles vaccine, you get the MMR. He was trying to make one that was separate, and so there's sort of, no one was ever going to take his measles-only vaccine if people kept going with the MMR. And so there were financial incentives. There were a lot of things going on there. Andrew Wakefield has lost his medical license in the United Kingdom. He now works in Texas. And again, like I said, there is a lot to be said about this. There have been millions and millions of dollars that have gone towards replicating and trying to prove or disprove this study, which I find particularly frustrating because that money could, the reason why they're doing that is that there are families who have somebody with autism who want to help them, and that money could have gone towards all sorts of other things that could be better at helping them. This is also about the specific vaccine, the MMR. Measles kills people. We are actually at a particular high in the United States for measles right now, and in fact, a world high in terms of number of measles cases this year. There have been a number of deaths in Samoa actually this weekend due to the measles. And so in some ways, this is also saying that parents would rather have their kid die of measles than have them get autism, which seems kind of rude to autistic people. Yeah. 1998. While vaccine complications are a thing, this is not a thing. But the question might come up in terms of, do we care? Does this matter at all? So what do you think in terms of whether or not we care, and why this might or might not matter? Yeah, Mark.
If people think it's real, then you're going to have less people getting vaccinated.
Okay. And in fact, yeah, Sydney. Yeah, exactly. So we talked about herd immunity last time and the importance of herd immunity. If we look, the red line is showing a number of people getting measles vaccines each year. And you can see that the number of people getting measles vaccines has been steadily decreasing because of this information or because of other sort of anti-vaccine information. We are at sort of impressive lows of percentages of people who are getting measles vaccines. As a result, we are now having measles outbreaks routinely. And there are studies that actually show that there are specific correlations between the number of people in an area who refuse vaccines and how many vaccine preventable diseases are being seen in that region. And so that's bad because it means you're at risk. It's also bad because it means that herd immunity is compromised. As you should have seen with the clinical assignment, the transmissibility of a microbe is very much related to what percent of people need to be vaccinated for herd immunity. It just so happens that measles is the most transmissible pathogen we know of. And as a result, measles needs the highest percentage for herd immunity to be effective. And it's the one that nobody's getting vaccinated against. Yay. And so the fact that we are having this major issue in terms of compromised herd immunity is a big problem. These are just some of the data indicating all of the different studies that have looked at vaccine status, vaccine uptake versus cases to show that association I mentioned on the previous slide about vaccine refusal and vaccine preventable diseases. So not great, right? If you were sort of, I don't know, reading up on the immunology literature or active on immunology Twitter or things like that, it turns out that there's another reason why we really care about this. And there were 2 papers that came out within the past month. They were also on the list of papers I was considering. One of which I'm going to say a little bit about. It is a follow-up from an earlier study by the same group. They're both of the papers I'm going to mention to you today are by an author named Mina et al., M-I-N-A, one from 2015, one from 2019. And you will see that both of those papers are posted on Moodle if you want to take a look at them, although they are not necessarily something that you want to write about for your assignment. And people had kind of had some ideas about this for a long time. But in 2015, this group showed these details first with this epidemiology study pretty well. And so what they showed here, if I can pull up the paper, so this is sort of the key thing, or some of the key things that they've seen. So if we look at these graphs that you can see, there are graphs from 3 different countries, either England and Wales, the United States, or Denmark. And in the dotted lines, you can see the number of measles cases per year in each of these areas. And one thing that you can notice is that there's this gray area on each of them. And that gray area is when that country started to vaccinate against measles. And so you'll notice, hey, look, we started vaccinating against measles, measles started to go down. We vaccinated against measles, measles went down. We vaccinated against measles, bye-bye measles. Pretty obvious on all of these graphs, right? But then you can also see another line on each of these graphs, and that line is shown in black. That line is the number of cases of infectious disease deaths due to things other than measles. And so what do you notice about these data? Correlation. So what does it look like is happening here? Yeah, Nick. There's something about the measles vaccine seems to protect you against not measles also. Not only do you seem to be protected against measles, you actually seem to see reductions in deaths due to other infectious diseases as well. And if we look further at their data, these are those same countries where they actually do a correlation between number of people with measles and cases of infectious diseases that are not measles. And what do you notice in all of those cases? Yeah, Sydney.
When there's a higher incidence of measles, there needs to also be a higher incidence of
Yeah, there's some relationship between measles being around and other infectious diseases being around. And you could sort of make a lot of arguments about exactly what's going on here. But what these authors sort of hypothesized, and again, the data in this paper is entirely sort of epidemiological data. But what these authors hypothesized is that at the beginning, this is pre-measles, you have some memory immunity, you have some naive immunity, and it seems like measles kills off all of your memory cells so that you become sort of immune deficient in responding to other things. This phenomenon has been talked about in the field as immune amnesia, and measles leading to immune amnesia for a while. Within sort of the past month or so, the same group did some additional experiments and published this paper where they actually measured immune responses in memory cells in people with or without measles. So before, it was sort of this idea of, well, if we look at population level changes, we can assume that measles is killing your immune response, is killing your memory response. But they didn't actually sort of show that mechanism. So here, why don't I have a zooming button? I don't want the things, no. So let's look at, we can sort of see the same thing. A and B are sort of the same, two different ways of looking at the same data. So they're looking at two different time points and sort of how many epitopes they are seeing responses to. So first look at the controls. What do we see with the controls? Are the number of epitopes that they see where they're getting responses at the two different time points very different? No. All right, what about in a person who is measles negative? What about in a person who got a measles vaccine? Maybe increases a little. What about people who got measles, either mild or severe measles? There's a massive drop in B cells to different epitopes. You can see that over here, where they look at specific pathogens, enterovirus, RSV, rhinovirus, influenza, and they see this happening. Here they actually are doing it for a number of pathogens. Blue means it goes away, red means it doesn't go away. And what you can see is in all of the measles cases, most of the patients they studied were blue. There's a lot of blue over here, is basically what we can see. So again, these patients are largely losing all of their memory cells. And they show this for B cells. Here you can actually see what proportion of the repertoire is remaining. And so you can see that with mild measles, maybe 70% is remaining. So 30% of the B cells are gone. With severe, it's maybe a little lower, 65. And if they keep going, they actually did the same thing in T cells, I believe, as well. Oh, here they actually look again at the percent change in the response against different microbes. -50, -30, -45, -54. Anything that's sort of purplish is a negative. And so you can see that measles infection is dramatically impacting the immune responses in these patients who are suffering from measles. And so not only, and this is also true in these patients who have mild measles. So the patient with mild measles, they're going to be like, yeah, measles, it's no big deal. Nothing bad's going to happen. Natural infection is so much better than getting a vaccine. Nothing bad happened to me from getting my mild measles. I might not even notice I had it. But now you can see their immune systems are getting severely diminished. And so what we are learning is that this issue of patients not getting their MMR, their measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, may actually have huge public health implications for our fight against infectious disease in general. And so it's a problem with, if you don't get your measles vaccine, you might get measles. If you would like to feel sad about measles, Roald Dahl, the guy who wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, his daughter died of measles. And he actually wrote a letter about how he felt about it and how he felt about wanting people to have measles vaccines. And it's sort of heartbreaking. It's pretty easy to find online. So A, you could, get measles and potentially die of measles. B, you're compromising herd immunity. So anybody you know who might be immunocompromised is potentially at risk. And C, you are potentially opening yourself up to this massive immunosuppression. And so we can see that this issue of, oh, it's sort of funny that some people are anti-vax, it's sort of funny that, this is a phenomenon out there, is actually quite a serious problem, public health-wise. So I also want to talk a little bit about a couple of other kind of big picture pieces of information about some of these vaccine studies. You can see the information here about immune response kinetics. And I've also shown you these data about immune response kinetics. But I want to talk through kind of a sort of made-up example right now. So we're going to imagine a virus. I'm going to pick a virus just because, but the specific details of it are actually not super relevant right now. We're going to say it's mumps. Okay? The reason why I'm picking mumps is because it's a virus that leads to an acute infection. So like, you get it, you get sick, you get over it, you're done. Or like flu could be the same thing, but you know too much about flu variation. Mumps doesn't have the same kind of variation. So we'll just pick mumps. This is different than something like, say, HIV, where you're going to have it for a long time. So we're talking about something that you get, and then you get better, and you're done. Okay? So let's imagine first, say, my grandparent. Okay? So this is my grandma. So this is going to be a graph of the size of the specific immune response over time. Okay. So now let's imagine at some point in time, my grandma gets the mumps. So she originally had some amount of immunity. It's kind of low, but she had at least one B cell, or at least one T cell. She made a primary response. And then she had a memory response, which was higher than what she had before, okay? And then she sort of, hung out. Okay, now, my grandmother has 4 siblings. So imagine that at some point in her life, her brother got the mumps. What happened when her brother got the mumps? So she was also going to be exposed to mumps antigen. And so what happened with her immune system? So she actually had, so here's the brother, here's her. So she made a secondary response to mumps. Bigger response, better. She never knew she got the mumps. She thought she lived happily ever after. She didn't even know that she was infected for 5 minutes. Okay? Now, remember, she's one of 5 kids. So now her sister's going to get the mumps.
Wait, why didn't everyone get the vaccine?
Because this is my grandmother. It's a long time ago. This is before the vaccine. Okay, so now her sister gets the mumps. What happens? She makes a tertiary response, and her response is really high. And you can imagine maybe she has some other kid in her kindergarten class has the mumps. And we can imagine going on and on and on, right? Now let's imagine she grows up and she never runs into a person with the mumps again. Okay? I'm playing fast and loose with years here. And when vaccines existed, but that's okay. So this last one was when so this is my grandmother, was when my mom had the mumps, her child. And then there was no more mumps. What happened to her immune system after that last time she got the mumps? Yeah. Yeah, so we're going to see this process of attrition. And so that response is going to be sort of decreasing almost asymptotically over time. Like that. So let's imagine that at this point in her life, my grandmother randomly runs into a person with the mumps. Is she going to get sick? No, why not? She has so much immunity. She's all good. Okay? So now let's imagine my mom. I am currently feeling like a terrible immunologist daughter because I don't actually know if my mom had the mumps. But let's imagine that she did. So my mom has the mumps. She makes a primary response. It looks exactly like the primary response we saw before. And then let's imagine the mumps vaccine is invented. Is my mom going to have any of her siblings give her the mumps? No. Right. We're going to say they get the vaccine. So my mom is actually a first grade teacher. Are any of her icky first graders going to give her the mumps? But no. Okay. Am I going to give her the mumps as her kid? No. And so what's going to happen to my mom's immunity to mumps? It's also going to undergo attrition. It's also going to come down. And what you can imagine is that at the same sort of age out here, if my mom were to encounter somebody with the mumps, suddenly she's going to potentially be sick, right? Now, let's think about, and so we could say, oh no, she's been exposed, she's all good, but she might get the mumps. My mom has not had the mumps that I know of. Maybe she did when we're imagining she did as a kid, but she never had it ever again in her life. But this happened to her immune system. Her immune system underwent this terrible attrition. How come my mom didn't get the mumps in this time? Yeah. Everyone else was vaccinated, and so herd immunity was protecting her. And we actually didn't know that your immune response tailed off like this because she was okay. Similarly, I got a mumps vaccine. I made an immune response to my mumps vaccine. I believe mumps vaccine is 3 shots. I made a secondary, I made a tertiary. I have never once, to my knowledge, met anybody with the mumps. So what's been going on with my mumps immunity? It's been undergoing attrition. And so what that means is that maybe at some point, even though I'm vaccinated, I could later in life end up with the mumps. I am possibly being protected right now due to herd immunity. So why am I saying this? Because this issue where our herd immunity is dropping for certain infectious diseases is suddenly telling us, oh, some of those immune responses that we used to think lasted forever don't actually last forever. Like we used to say, oh, I got a vaccine, I'm protected for my whole life. But it turns out part of the reason I was protected for my whole life was because of herd immunity. And if you start to take that herd immunity away, suddenly you realize that some of these immune responses decline a lot faster than we originally thought. Yeah, Mark? We'll come back to that. In particular, we have seen that mumps, it seems, so just like with measles, and what % you need for herd immunity and measles being super transmissible, there's sort of variations. Some things are more transmissible than others, need different amounts of herd immunity. It turns out the sort of half-life or the amount of attrition of different immune responses changes. And what we've learned is that mumps immune responses seem to go away really fast. Mumps seems to be like special in terms of how quickly it goes away. And so you can see that the data says that the protection wanes on average of 27 years after getting a vaccine. After 27 years of getting a mumps vaccine, you are susceptible again. You can also see that this is published in pretty recently. This is a 2018 paper. We have been seeing, if you look at sort of, you can see mumps cases decreasing over time pretty dramatically, and it looks like, you know, they went to like 0, right? But if we actually zoom in, mumps has been coming back in the United States as well, and it's also because of this herd immunity problem. Here, because we are uncovering this lack of persistence of the response. We previously didn't know this response went away so fast because it was sort of hidden. Herd immunity was still protecting people, but as herd immunity goes away, we have a problem. So, as a result of this paper, there was a recommendation done by the CDC. Who wants very easy participation points? You participate all the time. Emily. Can you read the last sentence of this? It starts at routine.
Use of herd vaccine dosage to age for booster dosing throughout adulthood may be a strategy to prevent mumps reemergence into the.
Yeah, and so it is very likely that the United States is going to start requiring an 18-year-old mumps booster for this reason, and because we are starting to see this reemergence, and we're realizing that this vaccine wanes more so than it does before. Yeah, Nick? Honest answer is because we can get to the 18-year-olds, because you can say to the people who are going to college, you need to do this before you go to college, whereas it's harder to sort of, I mean, we can't get everybody to get a flu shot at this point, and so it would be harder, but ideally, yes, you would say it should be, you know, every 10 years or so, you should be getting a mumps vaccine. Yep. I believe so. Yeah.
Is the booster just the same vaccine, or does it consist of other?
It would be the same vaccine. And so it would be just another mumps vaccine. So I know a bunch of people who I know, when they are traveling, have actually started getting measles boosters. So I know people who now when they travel abroad get a measles booster because measles is there are so many measles outbreaks around. So you can get any of these if you like go say you want it. So yes, you could go get a mumps vaccine if you so chose. So that's one story. But now I want to think about another sort of very similar story. This similar story has to do with another viral infection. In this case, it is Varicella Zoster, aka chickenpox. And so this virus, Varicella Zoster virus, causes a respiratory infection. The virus can then move into the lymph nodes, and eventually it will move into the skin, leading to a rash and sort of traditional chickenpox. However, viruses often need a way to kind of move around the body. They need some sort of highway to get around. One way, I'm going to tell you a couple of the highways that chickenpox uses, but the one that we're going to care about a bunch is that chickenpox likes to actually go into nerves in order to kind of use them as a highway and infect cells of the nervous system. So one of the things you may have heard about chickenpox is that it is more severe when you're older than if you're younger. So if you get chickenpox, you want to get it as a kid, because it's terrible if you get it as an adult. And I'd heard that forever. I think it was 2 years ago at a conference, and someone actually showed data that explained why. And I was like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. Why did no one tell me this before? It turns out that the way that the virus gets from your respiratory tract to your skin is that it actually gets a ride in memory T cells. And so if you're older, you have more memory T cells, and thus you can send it to your skin more often. And I was like, well, why did no one tell me this before? That makes so much sense. But the thing that we really want to talk about is this infection of nerves. Because this virus leads to a latent infection in between 1 to 7% of neurons. So if you have had the chickenpox, between 1 and 7% of your neurons still have this virus in them and will for life. So this is different than the mumps situation. This is a latent virus. So now we're going to go through the same kind of kinetics issue that we went through before. With this virus, we're going to have a slight difference. We're going to say that if your immune response ever goes below this dotted line, which I'm so not drawing very straight, dotted line, if your immune response ever goes below that dotted line, which is known as the threshold for protection, that virus can escape from those neurons. So normally the immune system is holding it in check in those neurons. But if your immune response ever gets too low, it can come back. And when it comes back in the form of a particular disease called shingles. So shingles is actually when your smallpox has reactivated. It's come back from where it was hidden. And it's done that because your immune response has gone below some threshold. All right, so now let's think about my mom. Once upon a time, my mom got the chickenpox. Here's her primary response to chickenpox. Then my mom babysat a whole bunch of kids in the neighborhood. So what probably happened to her? And she went to school and all that kind of good stuff. She was exposed to more chickenpox, so she probably got chickenpox again. And then she probably got the chickenpox again. And then she probably got chickenpox again. And none of these times, if you asked her, did you get the chickenpox, she would always say, no, I never got the chickenpox. Because her immune response was so huge that she never actually had disease symptoms. And so then, she's going along. And then she became a first grade teacher. And then she got the chickenpox from her students. And then she got the chickenpox again from her students. And then she got the chickenpox again. And then she had me, and then she had my sister, and she had a lot of chickenpox, okay? And so she has not, in a really long time, been around anybody with the chickenpox. And so her immune response is degrading. But what do we think about her likelihood of getting the shingles? So you think it's not very high. Why isn't it very high? Yeah, so she's probably going to have a good amount of memory cells. Well, now, what I will tell you that is not included here is that your immune system does change a bit when you get older. And so I'm sort of leaving that out for right now. So there's sort of an age-related thing on this as well. Of course, my mom is definitely not old, so, and I would never call her such. All right, so now, there's my mom. Now we're going to talk about me and the chickenpox. I had the chickenpox in 1984. There's my chickenpox response. My sister had the chickenpox. Yeah, I'll give myself a better response than that. And I have never met another person with the chickenpox in my life. So what does that mean?
I have chickenpox before 1984.
So this means that people in my age group who sort of got the chickenpox and then really never, like everybody younger than us?
We had chickenpox in 1974.
Okay, but we're talking about have I ever come across, like I'm in the last group of people who got chickenpox. Everybody after me got a vaccine.
Wasn't it great to be young?
Actually, no, because I've never met anybody else with the chickenpox, and as a result, my immune response is on its way out. And so my age group is sort of the poster children of people who are going to get the shingles really early because of this decreasing immune response. So there is a shingles vaccine. It's recommended for older people, but the recommendation age keeps having to be put down a little bit more and more because more and more there are people like me who got the chickenpox and then never saw somebody with the chickenpox again. And so there's sort of this group of us who are in bad shape. And so just so you know, the shingles vaccine is a chickenpox vaccine, but it's given at 2x dose. There is actually a new shingles vaccine that was released about a year ago. It leads to much better, like the immune responses are phenomenal. It leads to really nice immune responses. It also leads to some pretty bad side effects. So when, say, my mom complained about having to get it, I told her a lot about how great her immune responses were. Because it does lead to some really great immune responses, although it is sort of problematic. Yep. Because they were originally giving this vaccine in older people, and so they wanted to compensate for any immune system loss that was happening with age. So you can see that if you actually try to put some of this information together that we've talked about, it suddenly becomes really important in thinking about public health in general and sort of general biology. So I want to think about one other thing, partially because I almost feel like as immunology students, if you haven't heard some parts of this story, you're like, I'm like neglecting you or something. I don't know. So generally when you're an immunologist, you know some stuff about smallpox, because smallpox is like one of the classic diseases we think a lot about. This is a disease that happens with smallpox. It leads to the high fever, head and body aches, sometimes vomiting, a rash that leads to raised bumps and blisters that crust, scab, and fall off, leaving pitted scars. About a third of those who are infected die, and everybody who's left tends to have scars. And so if you read sort of old-timey literature and you hear about somebody being pockmarked, it means that they're covered with smallpox scars. You know, it was estimated to have led to 300 million deaths in the 20th century alone, and it was like eradicated in the 20th century. So this is really, 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 really scary and really, 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 really bad. The reason why immunologists frequently talk about and think about smallpox is because it's one of the first places where we started having kind of interventions for people's immune systems and doing something about it. If you look back in some very old literature, in some areas of Asia, there was this idea of doing something called variolation that could protect you against smallpox. And so the idea was if you took some scab from a person with smallpox and installed it in yourself, the most famous way was by inhaling it, you would get a mild infection and you would be protected. And so there was this idea that somehow if you kind of delivered yourself with a little bit of smallpox, you would be safe. And that was known for a really long time. The first place it's really recorded in English is in the letters of a woman named Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was the British ambassador to Turkey's wife, who wrote of this lovely practice she learned about while they were in Turkey. One thing I learned more recently is apparently they're having this huge problem in historical societies, because this virus is also one of the most stable viruses long term. Apparently when people had like a person with smallpox in their family, they would want to protect like their relatives, and so they would like mail scabs in the mail. And there are some historical societies that are now finding these letters, which are still like infectious now, and they're sort of like, you can imagine some like old historical society librarian suddenly having to deal with like biosafety level 4 materials in her library. And people knew about this for a really long time. And then the story goes that there was this guy named Edward Jenner. And in 1796, Edward Jenner did what most immunologists cite as the first immunology experiment. And so that's why we all talk about this. So he, the story goes, observed some milkmaids who had lovely skin and said, aha, if you are a milkmaid and you get cowpox from working with your cows, it protects you from smallpox. Thus, he took some cowpox. He infected an 8-year-old boy with it. The boy is named James Phipps. And then he intentionally infected him with smallpox. And he was fine. This, of course, would not pass any ethical things today. And he wrote the first immunology paper in 1798 about this story. And so this is sort of the other reason why, like I said, this is a big part of thinking about vaccines and thinking about immunology. Sort of one of those stories that every immunologist knows. So one thing I will tell you, because everyone loves this part of the story, is we've sort of realized more recently that this story is probably a lie. So you can see the myth of the milkmaid. Goats and Soda from NPR did a great story about it. So actually, it was most likely horsepox, not cowpox. And there was a traveling county doctor who had been going around doing this for a while, and Jenner learned it from him. Jenner just then was the first person to like publish it, so he like stole this other guy's idea and published it. And it was horsepox and not cowpox. Is the short version of the story, but there's much more that can be said. So as a result of all of this, that vaccine allowed for smallpox eradication. And this is the WHO's certification, the certificate, that says that smallpox was eradicated. I told you about how the smallpox vaccine is delivered last time, and it's really the same delivery that Jenner came up with. It worked then, and they just sort of keep going with it. But we also need to think about one other detail regarding smallpox. So you guys, for your clinical assignment, were looking at some parameters about herd immunity and transmission and things like that. And I think you had to figure out what % of people had to be immune in order for smallpox epidemics to stop. So we'll make up a number right now, because the exact number doesn't matter for this. But let's say it was 75%. Like I said, I just totally made up that number. 75% for a smallpox epidemic. Are you currently afraid of a smallpox epidemic? No, not really. What percent of you are vaccinated against smallpox? Yeah. Huh? 0. So, yeah, me. 1 out of 24. Which is way less than 75%. And yet you're not scared of a smallpox epidemic. And so there's one other piece to all of this that is sort of important to think about. In reality, sort of when we're thinking about the mathematical models of this, we think about something that's called the SIR model, which involves thinking about susceptibles, infected, so S is susceptible, I is either infected or immune, and R can stand for recovered, can stand for resistant, or can stand for removed, which is a very nice word for dead. Why aren't you worried about a smallpox epidemic, even though we're way below that percentage of infections needed for herd immunity? Yeah. Yeah. So if that virus has been eradicated, and really in order to eradicate some microbe, what you need to do is bring the number of infected people to 0. If the number of infected people to 0 is 0, then you don't care anymore. And people cannot be vaccinated, or people can stop being vaccinated. Can you think of any reasons why it might, so why did they stop smallpox vaccination then? So if you're in charge of this, why would you say we're not going to vaccinate anymore? Yeah.
If it's gone, then it's not likely that people will come in contact with it. And because it's such a recognizable virus, if someone does come in contact with it, it would be very noticeable and it would be easy to isolate them.
Okay. So it's gone, it's eradicated. Why not just for funsies keep giving the vaccine? Yeah, Jill. The vaccine's not, awesome. It has some potential side effects, and so we sort of have this cost-benefit analysis of, okay, we're not going to give this vaccine because we aren't worried about transmission of this virus anymore. Are there any bad parts to the fact that we've stopped vaccinating? Can you think of any downsides to that? Yeah, Nick. If it does come back, everyone's susceptible. So the story always has gone that there were 2 stocks that remained in 2 different lab freezers. There's some sketch with one of them. So yeah, right now, if it comes back, it's like me in the army that are vaccinated. So all right, so we're sort of potentially susceptible, and this is one of the things that people talk about a lot as a potential bioterror agent. Any other potential issues or potential sort of downsides that you might imagine that some of you learned about in another class from me that could be going on here? Yeah, where are the emerging infectious people at?
Wait, Tom, did you?
Yeah, Vanessa.
Potentially in underdeveloped countries, they might still have cases. Areas of Africa is such a globalization of the world, you're going to have cases spreading to other countries.
So it turns out that smallpox is a human-only pathogen. And so there are no smallpox cases anywhere. However, we have learned that there's this other virus that's really closely related to smallpox that is found in people in certain developing countries. And it turns out the smallpox vaccine was protecting them. And now that we're not smallpox vaccinating anymore, oopsies, there's extra cases of that disease, which is monkeypox. And so now we're starting to see all sorts of emergence of monkeypox in people who are too old or people who are too young to have gotten a smallpox vaccine. And so, again, realize that sometimes what we see going on here has to do a lot with issues of public health. So vaccines are awesome. The goal with a lot of vaccines would be to eradicate different infectious diseases. We have been successful on that exactly twice. We have eradicated smallpox, and we have eradicated something called rinderpest, which is a cattle infectious disease. They are trying very hard to eradicate polio, and types 2 and 3 have been eradicated, but not yet type 1. But we can also think a little bit about sort of big picture things with vaccines in terms of why we can't eradicate all the diseases, what's going on with all of this. And there are a lot of things here. One of them is that it has to be able to replicate in only one host, only humans. If you think about, say, dengue, which is in mosquitoes, if we were going to get to 0 infecteds of dengue, we would have to like kill all the mosquitoes. And so you could imagine that anything that replicates in more than one host is probably not eradicatable. Your vaccine has to last long term, and it has to work in everybody. It also needs to be something that's not stigmatized. It is expected that if we have an HIV vaccine, some people are going to be like, no, I don't need that. I'm not a bad person. And so with smallpox was a scary disease that nobody wanted to get, and it was not a stigmatized disease. If it's something that's stigmatized, we're going to have trouble with getting everyone having it. And so the other great thing is that with smallpox, if you have smallpox, it's really obvious. And so if we do have cases, we can isolate them, which we may not be able to do with all types of infectious diseases. And so what you can realize is that while all of this material about vaccines and infectious diseases is lovely, if you actually start to think about it in practical terms, things are a little bit tricky. So the last quick thing I want to tell you about is the tuberculosis vaccine. The tuberculosis vaccine is called BCG. And BCG is given at birth in some countries, countries that are more blue. Most everyone gets it. More than 90% get BCG at birth. As you get into some other countries, like the places that are the United States, which is white. I don't know why they have white for 2 colors here. Thank you, UNICEF. The United States does not give BCG. I just wanted to kind of tell you a couple of things. So BCG, this is potentially, the idea is that this is going to protect against tuberculosis. In fact, it can protect against, in theory, anything in the genus Mycobacteria, which includes both Mycobacterium tuberculosis and Mycobacterium leprae, which is the causative agent of leprosy. Seems like a good idea for a vaccine. You're like, I'm sad now, I don't get it. If you live in if you're born in one of these countries and you have a scar on your arm from a vaccine, it's a BCG scar. So BCG is a live attenuated vaccine. And so the way that it was done was that in 1908, they put it in culture. Specifically, they put a bacteria called Mycobacterium bovis, which is a relative of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and they left it in culture until you can see the 30s and 40s. And there were multiple places where this culturing was being done. And so there were multiple different strains that came out of this process. So there's something called BCG Pasteur. There's something called BCG Denmark. There's something called BCG Sweden, et cetera. And when somebody went and actually looked at the data of how useful this vaccine is against protection against tuberculosis, these were the data on vaccine efficacy. So what do you see here? It had different levels of success. Like in British school children, it was decently efficacious. In a Brazilian population, it was pretty efficacious. In the United States, it did nothing or it made it worse. And so in the end, each country made their own decision based on their own studies about whether or not to use BCG. And part of the reason for this variation is because there were so many genetically different strains that had come up as a result of this live attenuation. BCG is pretty good at blocking tuberculosis in very small children. But for things like adult tuberculosis, it really doesn't do much of anything. But it's important for kids' tuberculosis. In the United States, we have chosen actively to not give BCG because if we gave BCG, everyone would become PPD positive. And then all those times when we wanted tuberculosis test people, we would have to give them chest x-rays. And we decided if there are few enough people who are positive in the United States, it's actually better for our health system to not give this vaccine so that we can maintain the use of the PPD test and maintain that nice, cheap, low risk, easy test instead of having to give everybody chest x-rays all the time. And so again, there's sort of, when you actually start to think about the practicality of vaccines, life gets a little more complicated. Yep.
It's probably more advantageous because it decreases radiation.
Yeah, no, exactly, because it decreases the radiation exposure. And so this is sort of a lot that you've got to think about in terms of big picture for these public health programs. We're going to talk about cancer immunology on the Monday we get back. Please remember to give me your clinical assignment